Let's begin. So as I said, welcome to Moving Connecticut Ahead, Protecting Girls from Female Genital Mutilation and Cutting, or FGMC. This is an event hosted by the Connecticut Coalition to End FGMC in partnership with the Connecticut Commission on Women, Children, Seniors, Equity and Opportunity, and Sahiyo. My name is Meg Sinnott. I am a coalition member and the program's assistant at Sahiyo. I'm joining you today from Colorado. We have closed captions available for this event today, so if you would like to use them, you can go to More on your Zoom and then say Show Subtitles for you to get that experience. Next slide, please, Kate. So to review the agenda for the event, first I'll give an introduction to the topic, then I'll hand it off to Steven Hernandez for the panel discussion, after which there'll be an audience Q&A and closing remarks. Next slide. For those unfamiliar with FGMC, the World Health Organization has defined FGMC as all procedures involving the partial or total removal of external female genitalia or another injury to the female genital organs for non-medical reasons. Internationally, it is recognized as a human rights violation that can cause negative health consequences, such as difficulties during childbirth, lifelong psychological and emotional trauma, and in some cases, even death. Yet, despite negative consequences, FGMC is practiced worldwide as it is viewed as a social norm by practicing communities, meaning that whether the reason is tradition, cleanliness, culture, religion, controlling a woman's sexuality, marriageability, or maintaining purity, FGMC is viewed as a normalized practice being done for the good of the girl. Next slide, please. To help illustrate the impact of FGMC a bit more, we'd like to show you two short videos from Sahiyo's digital storytelling project called Voices to End FGMC, a project that seeks to support survivors to tell their stories in order to heal and advocate against FGMC. Please feel free to share your reactions in the chat box as well. Also, these videos are not graphic, but we understand that it's a sensitive and tough subject. And if you need to step away for a moment, please do. You can play the video, please.
I was born in 1944 to a loving Midwestern American farm family. We were close to the earth and our animals. When I was 3, my mother became concerned that my face turned red when I touched my clitoris. She brought me to a doctor, and the doctor cut me. My mother said, "Don't ever talk about this." I was alone with my questions as a child, teenager, and young adult. I did not discuss nerve damage discomfort, even with my sisters. When I gave birth to my first child, I did not talk about the complications I faced. I wanted a natural labor, but the doctor didn't know what to do. He put me under to perform an extensive episiotomy. I awoke 4 hours after my daughter was born, and it took my body months to heal. I told a couple from my church about what had happened to me as a child. They said, "Don't ever tell that story again." Later, I shared with women at work who said, "Don't repeat that or you'll ruin your career." But is this really my shame? What about other women having their babies with doctors who don't know what to do? I could not stay silent, and I started reaching out to new people. My Somali friend Filsan Ali and I produced a bilingual brochure for infibulated Somali women to give to their doctors to make safe labor and delivery plans. I went public internationally, and my close friends and family supported me. Creating art and connecting with nature has helped me heal. I've learned to spin wool and weave on a loom. I have found peace in flower gardens, weeding, deadheading, and making bouquets. Today I live where eagles soar and deer feed by a river. I hope my story will help people be aware that girls have been cut in cultures throughout the world.
Thank you. And we'll move on to the second video now.
I'm a proud Dawoodi Bohra, and I'm against female Khatna in my community. Some people think that I can't be both. The local Amil sent me a message, through a mutual contact, saying that the work I do to end female Khatna is good, and that I should not talk about it publicly. I tried to arrange a meeting with him, but he kept delaying it and delaying it. Then Zehra announced that female Khatna is required, and must be done in secret. And the Amil and his contacts stopped talking about it with me. But I kept talking, and people on social media hit back. How can you be a real Bohra? You don't wear Rida. You don't attend masjid regularly. You don't follow what Zehra says without question. But if I question one practice, does that mean I am not a member of the community? Am I not a real Bohra? Am I exposing the community's secrets? But wait, whose secret is it? The girls or the community's? Our community is known for being progressive. People say Bohra women are educated, not like in other groups. They're encouraged to have careers, to lead. This is our reputation, and yet we are still cut. I've heard our people defend Khatna. It makes Bohra women focused. It's what helps them be serious about their careers. Without it, you'd see more Bohra couples divorcing. It keeps our women healthy. I'm a proud Dawoodi Bohra. I love my community and always have. I had my misak, I married a Bohra, we raise our kids Bohra. I think if you love your community, then you help it grow. And if I had a daughter, I would not have her cut. I hope my story will make people realize that you can love a community and want to help it without destroying it.
Thank you. As I said earlier, please feel free to share your thoughts in the chat. As Renee and Zehra's stories show, FGMC can happen to women and girls from a variety of backgrounds. Within the United States, the estimate is that over 500,000 women and girls are impacted by FGMC. In Connecticut, the Population Reference Bureau has estimated that in 2013, 2,658 women and girls are at risk of undergoing or have already undergone FGMC. Although we know this statistic, like with other forms of gender-based violence, is likely an underrepresentation of the true number of those impacted by FGMC in the US, it helps to reveal that FGMC is an issue in the US and in Connecticut. However, Connecticut remains one of the 10 states in America without any state-level law protecting future generations from this harmful practice. Next slide, please. As you can see from this map, the other 9 states without any legal protection in place are Hawaii, Washington, Montana, Nebraska, New Mexico, Alabama, Alaska, Maine, and Mississippi. Additionally, Washington, D.C. is without a law. Next slide, please. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to our moderator for the panel discussion today, Steven Hernandez, to let the discussion start on FGMC and what we can do in Connecticut to address the issue. Steve is the Executive Director of the Connecticut Commission on Women, Children, Seniors, Equity and Opportunity, a nonpartisan agency for the Connecticut General Assembly. At the Commission, Mr. Hernandez serves as the legislative lead for the state's 2-Gen initiative, an approach that puts family at the center of improved community outcomes as drivers of long-term economic success. Thank you so much for joining us today, Steve.
Thank you so much, Meg. It's an honor to co-host this really important conversation with you. You know, Connecticut has been ranked one of the best states for gender equality and has addressed many other women's issues with legislation. But for some reason, we've overlooked FGMC. Today, we're looking to discuss this issue and how we can move forward to rectify that. Gender equality is a key priority for the state of Connecticut. In fact, U.S. News and World Report recently lauded Connecticut for its achievements on this issue, especially when it comes to equal access to economic opportunities. But even economic equity is limited when we don't have the full participation of all of our women and girls. One, harmful customs or social norms, as we call them, that contribute to gender-based violence, including female genital cutting and mutilation, in addition to causing lifelong pain and suffering, hold back women from full participation. Discriminatory customs are entrenched in social norms and configurations of power, inevitably tied to one's own status and place in communities. Much like other harmful practices of similar nature, female genital mutilation reflects and perpetuates a broader trend of gender inequality. We must support uplifting a holistic or multifaceted approach to how we address FGMC, as we have for other harmful social norms like domestic violence. One tool that Connecticut has used effectively is laws, enacting laws that advance equal pay in the workplace, safeguard access to healthcare services, and increase access to childcare. All of these laws contribute to gender equality and equity. Law defines the state's values and can help end harmful social norms like gender-based violence and other harmful practices, including FGMC, regardless of a community's particular rationale for these norms, because the law is universal and every community deals with the same law. Communities adapt differently based on their social norms, but in most cases where a harmful social norm is entrenched, laws are necessary to shift mindset. Laws can educate. Laws can set the standard that we want for our communities and provide for accountability and sanctions when those standards are broken. For example, the drinking age. So I'd like to welcome today our speakers, our panelists, our esteemed panelists who are here with us today. I'm going to actually do this a little bit differently, and rather than give a big introduction, I'm going to ask you a question, each of you a question, and as you, in the magic of Zoom and Facebook, your image will come to the fore and we'll be able to see you more clearly. So I'm going to start, just a question for each of you. If you could just please introduce yourself and tell us why you're part of the Connecticut Coalition, or at least are supporting the work being done to end FGMC in Connecticut. And after that, I'd love to know what the FGMC impact is in Connecticut. In other words, why is this an important issue for us to care about? Let's start with you, Faith. I'm going to recognize you as I see you. Faith.
Hi, thanks, Steve. For I think most of my life, if my mother was here, she would tell you that it's practically all of my life I've been an advocate. As a social worker for the past 21 years for children's issues and children's rights. When I was first approached about this issue, it was nothing that I had ever heard of before, and just simply thought this can't be happening at that time, 2020. We grow in so many ways in so many areas that this is still a practice that we would be harming children, young girls with this practice. So for me to hop on board and learn more about it and actually have done some presentations on this is, I think, the right thing to do for children in our state.
Thank you, Faith. Same question for you, Zehra. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you to all the panelists today. My name is Zehra Patwa. I am a long-time Connecticut resident. I've been here for nearly 30 years. I found out, I'm part of a Shia Muslim community called the Dawoodi Bohras, as you may have seen from my video. I have found out 10 years ago, only 10 years ago, that most of the girls in my community were cut. And I also found out at the same time that I was cut, which was pretty horrifying to find out, that late into your life. And to this day, I still do not have memory of that event. So thankfully, I've been spared a lot of the trauma that so many people have had. But that prompted me to take action. And as Renee said in her video, to not be silent any longer. And I co-founded a group called We Speak Out. We primarily work within the Bohra community, the Dawoodi Bohra community, which is all over the world.
but knowing that there are people in this state, as there are everywhere else, that are part of this community and part of other communities that practice FGMC, it was natural for me to want to be a Connecticut Coalition member. I'm really excited that I got involved. It's an amazing group and really brings together so many different kinds of people, kinds of organizations, and that's what we really needed. You know, from a community perspective, there's only so much we could do, but to have experts who understand the social aspect, the social norms, the legal aspect has been really satisfying. So I'm really proud to be part of the Connecticut Coalition.
Thank you, Zehra. Welcome, Michelle. Same question for you.
Thank you, Steven. My name is Michelle Dumas Keuler. I'm one of 2 managing directors of the legal division at the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. The Commission is the state enforcement agency for the civil rights statutes in Connecticut. And what that means is we are ensuring every day through litigation, education, outreach, all sorts of trainings, that the people who are in Connecticut are not being discriminated against. And at its very base, the female genital mutilation it's never so frank, it's against females. And so, which is a massive group we protect on all levels in terms of families, marriage relationships, in the home and at work. We've been a coalition member for the last 2 years, supporting the group in the ways that we can through our advocacy, through our legislative work, which we are very involved with in terms of passing legislation here in Connecticut where it does not currently exist. Because as the protector of the civil rights statutes in Connecticut, nothing could be more to the core of that than protecting women against these practices.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank each of you for that introduction. You know, Zehra, as you mentioned, you come from a practicing community where FGMC has been a custom. Recognizing FGMC as a social norm, can you speak a little bit more about how FGMC can continue in communities? What justifications are given for it, and how do those justifications speak to the challenge of changing social norms, particularly with FGMC?
So I just want to start by saying that we need to not demonize parents who take their children to be cut. I think, you know, the intent is not to hurt their child, but the action does hurt their child in some way or other. So, you know, we think of this practice as being so horrific, but we also translate that feeling to the parents or other family members who might take girls to be cut. And I just want to kind of point out from a community perspective that parents usually are not, very often, I think for the majority of the cases, are not taking their daughters to be cut to harm them, to actually harm them. They're taking them to be cut because they believe it protects them. And I think it's a real nuance that sometimes gets lost because the practice itself is so terrible. But with that said, there are plenty of other things that connect somebody with their community, and FGMC should not be one of those. It's not, I've heard people say that it shows your identity as part of society, but I don't know that there are very many opportunities to show off your clitoris to show that you are part of the community. Maybe, you know, customary dress or headdress or something like that would show that, but it's not like you could tell that somebody is cut or not just from looking at them. So that whole idea of identity and being part of the community because you are cut it rings kind of hollow. In the borough community, it's very much a case of preventing girls from becoming promiscuous. So there is this very deep-seated, as Renee's video showed us, that very deep-seated view that we can keep girls on the straight and narrow, keep girls from being too promiscuous if we cut them. And that has been long-standing for generations. And I think so many communities continue to cut their girls because of the fear of what would happen if they don't. And I think that fear is what pushes a lot of people to go ahead and do that, even knowing that in so many places in the US and with the federal law, it is illegal. And that's what worries me so much too. And I've also talked to a lot of people in our community who have said, I did not cut my daughter, but I have told her to tell other people that she has been cut if they ask, because of the potential backlash of what people would think if they knew that this daughter was not cut. And it's really, it's very sad, because I've heard more people say that they have not cut their daughters and do not want the practice to continue. And that is, I wish more people would speak out and talk about how they are not cutting their daughters, because it really would give so many other people, the message that it really shouldn't be happening.
Zehra, thank you. Such a remarkable intersection between what we understand to be social norms with what we know to be gender-based violence. And when those two things come together, it can be difficult to understand the why, but we see and understand the impact. And, I'm reminded again that this is the reason that laws are compelling in this case, because the law creates a different set of expectations, a renewed set of social norms that everyone can look to in their day-to-day. So thank you for that description. We're so fortunate that we have you, the panel here, as some of our leaders in the state who have coalesced against the practice, but there are others. There's a network here, and among them is Martine Dherte. Martine is the Director of Refugee Services at the Connecticut Institute for Refugees and Immigrants. She uses her platform to educate newly arrived refugees resettled by her organization in Bridgeport. While Martine is unable to join us live because she's out of the country, she wanted to share her thoughts on harmful social norms and how they are impacted by law in Connecticut. If you could just play the video, please.
Harmful norms in CT definitely are impacted by law and by culture in different ways. The first of it being that people tend to think that it doesn't happen here. And so there is no law that is really designed to protect a woman. Always with the eyes of this happens to immigrants. It doesn't happen to those that are here born in America, which of course is a myth, right? I mean, GBV, and even FGM happens right here in our own country. These are, to the eyes of the government, secret society. They don't know about it. FGM, for example, is not necessarily done by doctors. It's these women who are able to do it in secretive practice, if we want. They're very well known within their circle, but not to the outside world. They're not reported. So if it is not reported, it is really not counted by law. It's very difficult to put a number of how many cases of FGM have happened here in the US, especially here in Connecticut. We know it happens. It's just not something that people talk about. And I think because it's so hush-hush, people tend to not even think that it exists, which makes it really difficult. And I think, this is where our government and our state needs to learn about, speak about it, admit that it actually happens, and look into it, and look into where there are practices, looking at where are the concentrations of population that live, and see if it happens there, get to know them, learn about the practices, talk about it. For the hospitals have a way of finding out when it happens, when a woman goes to a hospital, or for FGM and for GBV, are there? it's really not well defined. So I also think there hasn't been the right wording for it. There hasn't been the right access to it. There hasn't been the right definition of it. And then how do you protect this woman? How do we protect them? Because within their culture, the women who perform these are seen as, you know, doctors. And I mean, they're referred to as doctors, even though they're not really doctors. But they have such a high view, or they're being, you know, put on this pedestal to some form. But yet, you know, they don't really have a full practice. They have never studied. It's more harmful. People die from it. I mean, people are not able to have children in the later years from it. So it's like there's multiple suffering that is done where we don't see it. We don't hear about it. You don't hear about that in the news. You don't hear about anything that has been discovered. You don't hear about laws that are being designed to protect anybody. We are, you know, there's really nothing that has been done. And I mean, to some degree, there's a little bit of progress, but not much. I mean, today I was just typing really quickly, like GBV in the US, like to see, you know, data. What's the latest data? There is no data since 2017 for the US. Yet, if I look at GBV worldwide or in specific area, you know, we have it. And again, we know that the numbers are extremely low compared to the reality as well. But it's that people are not going to talk about it if they are afraid of it, if it's not acceptable, if they know that they're going to be put aside by families, by communities, which is usually what happens. Communities just, you know, disengage completely from them. So what's the support system? Does the US have actually a support system for these women? No, absolutely not. There is nothing. I mean, if I look at South Africa, has more laws in place to protect women and girls that the US does. And that's just not normal if I look at it in that way. You know, we consider ourselves the most advanced country, yet when it comes to protecting girls, women and girls, we are far, far behind. And that's a shame, you know, when it comes to our government. We're not equal. We're told multiple times, again and again, that we're not equal, that men are higher, or are more important, or are more valued. I mean, just looking at our salaries, you know, and the salary of a woman, basic thing, we're not equal. And again, in that matter of life and death and of our survival, we don't count. I mean, abortion, we don't count, and yet it's our body. You know, it's happening to us, yet we have been stripped off of our rights, and that continues to happen in the States, while in other countries they are starting to look at it. You know, so shame on us in that sense.
Thank you, Martine. Thank you, Martine. It's remarkable, you know, that in so many ways we consider ourselves a leader among states and a leading country among countries. And yet it's so clear that when it comes to gender-based violence, there's an ambivalence, and a disturbing ambivalence in our laws, and a disturbing ambivalence in what we allow ourselves to learn and know. And, you know, there's, as Martine was speaking, I'm reminded of an adjacent practice, not the same. This is that practice, the conversion therapy practice, which was recently outlawed in the state of Connecticut, designed through violence or coercion to break the human spirit. In this case, violence committed against a girl's body to mutilate or disfigure, to control the child in some way. What's interesting is that there are examples, and Zehra, perhaps you can share with us, are there other harmful societal norms in Connecticut that have been impacted by law and culture, that have seen the change that we're looking for here?
Well, I think you've named so many of them, Steve, and Martine mentioned as well. I mean, abortion is a huge one that clearly affects a woman's body. It affects society in general, but clearly, you know, it relates to a woman's body. With FGC, you know, it's very easy to think that it either has no effect because women look okay, but the trauma that they carry with them is so profound that it could come out in different ways. I talked with someone who, up until their 40s, had no apparent reaction to their trauma, and then in their 40s had to be taken to the hospital because they really had a very violent reaction to their trauma. So some of this is so deep-seated that it's really hard to separate it out, and it does cause a real issue with anything that a woman wants to do, and it takes away their freedom because they're torn by this trauma.
Thank you, Zehra. I'd like to open up the floor to our other panelists here. And I think for me, the fundamental question as we think about moving policy and advancing policy are the challenges. And what do you see as some of the challenges towards moving forward to address this particular issue in Connecticut? Faith.
It's interesting, Steve, because when I got involved with the group, I thought, oh, this is a low-hanging fruit type of legislation that, that there's not going to, who's going to be opposed to, this kind of violence for girls. Some, could be as young as their infancy, but very often, younger girls, second and third and fourth grade as sort of the rite of passage, that we've come so far in our child protection laws, that there's federal legislation around this, that this would be just really an easy lift. And I think for all the things that we heard Zehra and Martine, talk about, is that people sort of shy away because it's believed to be part of a culture. I think what we know, Zehra's talked about this a lot in the committee meeting, that people believe that this is sort of a religious practice, and we don't want to step on people's religion and religious practices. And in fact, most mainstream religions don't support female or young girl cutting. So I think the surprising thing is that Connecticut is one of just 10 states in the country, and for all the progress that we have. And again, I just thought this would be a very easy lift for us. We never want to be far behind. We're progressive in so many parts of our state laws. But there's been some pushback on this because of cultural, people's perception about cultural norms and stamping on people's sort of rights and freedom.
Thank you for that, Faith. Same question to you, Zehra. What are some of the barriers that you've seen in adopting laws in Connecticut? We're one of the few now, one of the few states that hasn't.
Yeah, I, much like Faith, am surprised that we don't have a law, but as we've been discussing the ins and outs, the details, it's amazing what kinds of things stop this from becoming such a no-brainer law to pass. I think because we are a very liberal state, we are sensitive to lots of different kinds of people, and that's a good thing. But I think that sometimes stops us from moving forward on these harmful practices. And I think that's what we have to separate out. You can be sensitive to lots of different issues, but still be tough on harmful practices. And I know that in practicing communities, people will say, well, this is not harmful. And people who have been cut will say, this is not harmful. But we are talking about children. We are talking about little girls that do not have a say. And you have no idea what's going to happen to them in the future. And, that deep-seated trauma that happens to them, there's no way to know if it's going to affect them years down the road. So, that getting past that, I think, is going to be really important. And I understand the issue of not wanting to upset certain communities, maybe immigrant communities, but I'm here to tell you and to reiterate that this happens in communities everywhere, and it happens in communities, whether they're immigrant communities or based here. There was a 2017 charge, the first federal charge of FGMC in the country, of a US doctor, a US born and trained doctor who cut 2 girls in Detroit, Michigan. And these girls were brought from Minnesota. This doctor was part of my community, and the girls who were cut were part of my community. And, there was a lot of discussion about how do we be sensitive so as not to make it, an Islamophobic issue. And I understand people are trying to be very sensitive, but you separate out the culture and the practice. And people ask me, why am I still part of my community? Why do I still, claim to be a Dawoodi Bohra? Because I love my community. As I said in my video, I'm very firmly part of my community, but I disagree with this one practice. And that's, as we develop this law and push it through, we really need to make sure that, we're just separating out the practice, not the people and not the whole community.
Thank you, Zehra. This is it's at its core, at its foundation, it's a human rights issue. And it strikes me that as part of a community, an international community of human rights, there are, depending on the social norm, it is difficult to address them locally, especially when, as an international community and as a local set of states that protect the rights of the individual, it's tough to think that some of these things may be happening in the shadows. In fact, we don't want to think about it. And it's in the shadows that often the most vulnerable get hurt, in this case, little girls. So thank you for bringing that back to the fore. Michelle, think about laws and human rights, right? The rule of law, specifically in policy. How does the rule of law play a role in protecting fundamental human rights, and in this case, the right of physical and bodily integrity of a little girl?
The laws are shaped by the people in need, essentially. And so the laws that we enforce are not ones that we just sat around at a conference table one day and decided, oh, we're going to protect these groups. They are historically groups who have been persecuted or treated differently for their inclusion in that group. And so the laws move with the groups that need the protection. And as you noted earlier before, Stephen, we're talking about the conversion therapy being outlawed. On this Saturday, on October 1st, a victim of domestic violence is going to be added to our statutes across all levels in response to the fact that people who are victims of domestic violence need protection in various aspects of their work and family life and home life. And so this too needs to move in a direction to identify the fact that there are people who are still subject to this practice in Connecticut. And while, any number is too much of a number, and I think that, seems to be the resounding issue, is that, well, it's not enough. Well, but what is enough? We don't categorize what is enough. We look at the communities who are being affected, whether they all happen to fit into one group, which this one absolutely squarely does, and the fact that there doesn't need to be a litmus test of how many in order to have the protections of the law. I challenge any of you to read through our statutes. They're rather thick and it will take you a long time to get through them. But there's plenty of laws that you may look at and say, well, those laws exist and there's lots of thought behind them because someone or something was affected. And so, like I said, there isn't a litmus test to how many of that person needs to be affected for it to be a protection. That's what we do. And that's why we're progressive. Here in Connecticut, of all states, we live in a very progressive state. And so this really is our calling to make sure that we continue in line with that and our progress.
Thank you, Michelle. We in Connecticut, purple as we are, we do pride ourselves as leading the nation in so many different ways. We seem to be behind the times when it comes to this particular protection against gender-based violence. So thank you, Michelle. Faith, you've, in addition to your work for the Child Advocate's Office, and thank you for that work, you've been a social worker as well in the state of Connecticut for many years. And how have you seen changes in laws affect harmful social norms? And do you think that they could have a similar effect on the issue of female genital mutilation here in Connecticut?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks for your kind words. It's interesting. I could give lots of examples. Certainly from a child welfare, perspective, we look at some of the first child welfare laws in this country really emanated from the protection of animals. there were no child protection laws. And when people realized that children needed protection, what they went to was the Humane Society and some of their laws on the protection of animals. We are nowhere compared to where we were in the mid-19th century on that. I mean, we recognize, although we're not where we should be in this country, because we're one of the few countries, and maybe the only progressive country that does not recognize the rights of a child in terms of, just a global human rights issue. But we do have wonderful child protection laws. Just to piggyback a little bit on what Michelle said, I was involved for 20 years on the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Task Force. And when, you just think back a handful of years ago, maybe 20, we had the practice and policy was when police arrived at the house, have the man kind of walk it off, and it was the Tracy Thurman case that changed that. Michelle had said that there's going to be a change in the CHRO statute for protections for victims of domestic violence. On October 1st, on Saturday, another law goes into effect, protecting victims of domestic violence who may be using dating web sites, and protections that the person who is on there professing to be, maybe a nice person, that these systems have to do a background check. And that there'll be penalties up to $25,000 for not doing that. I mean, that is, a 360 degrees turn from where we were in just 20 years ago. And that is not only social norms, but it's society, what society decides it wants to value and think is important. I think about our child trafficking. Trafficking, we've had, it's almost been 2 decades since people recognized trafficking in this state, but child trafficking is only, maybe 8 years old in the state because people didn't think about children being trafficked. Now you can't go any place in the state where we're not having a conversation about that. And the first, not unlike FGM, what's the impact? And we didn't know what the impact was. People thought that there was no child trafficking in this state, that we were simply a pass-through between Boston and New York. Oh yeah, 84. We know where Connecticut is. You have to go through it to get to either Boston or New York. But in 2021, I think there were 241 cases of child trafficking reported to child welfare. So when we shine the light on things and we pull back the curtain and we realize what's happening, I think we're surprised on what's happening, but it's only then that we can address the issue, when the curtain is pulled back and the light is shined.
Faith, it's remarkable. You and I know that it wasn't so long ago, even here in the state of Connecticut, where a minor, a little girl that was being trafficked for her body was called by law, was designated a prostitute in the state of Connecticut, which is just, it's mind-boggling that a child that does not have control over, in that moment that they're being trafficked, just has no free will in that moment to be considered this term, which is used to criminalize a certain behavior, is just mind-boggling to me. And it was only a couple of years ago when that changed. And
it is so readily recognized now. It wasn't it wasn't an overnight where everybody bought into it and said, well, yes, we're going to, look at these kids in this way. But I would be shocked to be any place in Connecticut, any arrest that occurs, that somehow they're not looking at that child as a trafficking victim. And it's a whole different set of responses, not incarceration and punishment, it's treatment and care.
Faith, I want to open up Zehra, I see you unmuting. Do you have a reflection?
Yeah, my thought is, I hope it doesn't take Connecticut 8 years to get to that point with FGMC. We've learned so much from these other harmful things that are happening, and we've got protective laws against. So this should not take us that long. We've been through this before. This should be fairly straightforward.
Zehra, Faith, Michelle, there's a question that comes to mind, and a thoughtful participant on our panel here today, one of our guests has asked in the chat, if a medical professional in Connecticut sees signs of FGMC, are they not required to report it under current law? And in that case, our current general child protection laws, some of which you mentioned, Faith, are they insufficient? Or are they simply not being applied due to cultural protections? Which is it? Are our current laws in the books enough? And if they are they not being applied for specific reasons?
Yeah, I mean, I would ask Michelle to chime in as well, but I don't think the existing laws are enough because we don't know, part of what, when we're looking at crafting an FGMC law in Connecticut, I mean, first and foremost, one of the things we think is essential is public education. So people simply don't know what FGMC is. They don't know if it's legal or not legal. Could someone who, first of all, if it's already, a doctor discovers a case, well, it's already happened. I'm not sure, how reportable that is, right now. But if we knew something was about to happen to a child, like she was going to be taken out of the state or someone in state was going to cut her, yes, that would absolutely be a child protection law. But I can tell you, as of when we asked about a year ago, there have been no cases reported in Connecticut. And again, it's because people aren't aware. So I think the states that have enacted laws, I had met with a young woman who was instrumental in passing the Vermont legislation. And one of the things that she felt really strongly about was that public education needed to be an essential component to get the message out there. And we've certainly seen that with, lots of social issues, that you have to educate folks about the practice, and then, whatever may follow. But I don't think things are sufficient right now to really protect girls.
Thank you, Faith. Michelle, your reflections.
A few things. I agree with Faith 100% that education is really the key to any change in our laws. As an example, when we passed changes to sexual harassment statutes back in 2019, there was an education component requirement within the statute, which is why all of you might have heard this voice before, because we provided free sexual harassment training. And the same goes with the change to the statute as it relates to domestic violence. Every state worker in the state of Connecticut is required to take 1 hour of domestic violence training to know A, what domestic violence is, and B, what the changes to the statutes are as it relates to this addition of this protected class. And there will be a literature surrounding that too. Education is the key. It's one of the missions of the commission is to educate the public about the laws so that people know they exist, they know what they apply to, and they know hopefully to follow them. But on the second note, I do know, as somebody who's been doing this for a long time, is that even though laws exist, not everyone is going to utilize them for a variety of reasons. And so when you have a circumstance where people may be unfamiliar with the law or they're afraid of what the reporting aspects of it mean down the line for their family, for their parents, for their friends, for their community, they're not going to essentially exercise their rights under the law if there's any sort of discomfort, fear, retaliatory belief, which is part of our statute that protects against people who are retaliated against for using our statutes, which is essential because of that. And I think we need to find ways to make the law presentable and allow the community to know about it and feel comfortable with it. And a very, very sensitive subject on many levels, family, religion, all of the things that are very important to people, or they're not going to utilize the statute because they're just not comfortable.
Thank you, Michelle. I am going to come back to you because I want to pick out a nuance of enforcement and any federal laws that may exist in the space, and why does Connecticut need its own law? But I'll come back to that, Michelle. But first, Zehra, we were talking a little bit about education. I want to simmer in the space of education, the importance of education and outreach. You've participated in so many different forms of education and outreach. How does legislation work together with some of the efforts that are already in place to not only inform, but to perhaps in some ways bring to light some of what's happening in the gender-based violence that's committed through FGM?
I would say it's vitally important to have a law because it just sets a standard. When the 2017 case in Detroit, Michigan happened, we had so many calls from people saying, I didn't know it was illegal. So, the law had been on the books since the 90s, but nobody knew about it. And so this practice had been continuing, right here in the USA, So I think like it sets the standard that this is considered something that's not acceptable to our society. And it may have been something that a community has been doing for generations, but it's not acceptable as part of this society. Now, there is a saying from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in Islam, that you respect the laws of the land that of your abode, of where you're living. So with that said, if the law of the country that you live in says that, you should not do this, this is not a norm that we accept, you have to respect that, because that is a fundamental part of the religion. This practice of FGMC is not a fundamental part of the religion. It is a cultural practice. And it has been studied no end that there is very little religious backing for this in so many religions. And yet people do it because it's more of a cultural practice. So I think the education, and just primarily educating people that there is no value in there's no value in doing this cutting. If anything, it's harmful. There's no upside to it. There's only risk. And, do you want to risk, hurting your child? Because the intent of doing this was never to hurt your child. So having that education really helps people to stop and think. So many of the conversations I had early on when I first started talking about this issue was people just did it without thinking, because it's something that had been going on for generations, and they just did it without questioning, including my mother. And so I had a lot of conversations with people about why they did it. And for the most part, it was just because we did. That's what we've always done. And by having a law as well as education, we can show that that's not necessary. It doesn't have this strong religious backing that people say it does. It doesn't have any medical value like some people say it does. It only has downside risk. So why would you want to risk your child doing that? And once we had started talking more about that and educating people, we were finding that more and more people were speaking out and saying, no, I'm not going to do this, because I want my child to be, intact. I want her to be whole. I don't want her to be traumatized. And once they realized that, it wasn't worth it, because they could still be part of the community and not do this practice and not hurt their child.
Zehra, thank you so much. Michelle, if there is a federal prohibition, and maybe you can tell us whether there is, why isn't that enough? Why do we need a law in Connecticut?
Well, there is a federal prohibition, but it's actually very different than the proposed changes to the statute that are here in Connecticut, which really do focus on education and study and other than a civil. The federal law really focuses on the criminal aspects of it, of this offense, for the people who are involved with it. And I can say, just from a practical perspective, so we're talking about there's definitely differences between the state statute and the federal statute that exists, is access. I work at the State Enforcement Agency for the Civil Rights Statutes. We are partners with the EEOC, which is the Federal Agency for Employment, and HUD, which is the Federal Agency for Housing. And people can file complaints in those places, but they then have to go through the federal agencies or go to federal court themselves. There's no federal agency associated with the federal statute here. It means that people would have to bring claims directly into court at the federal level, which is scary, even for me, who's been a lawyer for 25 years, and expensive. And so having state access is just much more practical for the actual enforcement of the statute for people here in Connecticut, as opposed to having to leverage using a federal statute for protections.
Thank you for that. And there's another wonderful question in the chat function. Thank you so much for our viewers who are communicating with us. Has the coalition done consultations with FGMC affected communities during the process of developing a proposed law?
Absolutely. I think Zehra may, or Maria may have responded that, we do work with various communities. We have a constant outreach to groups, whether it's immigration groups, individual grassroots. We were working with a young woman, I think her background was Sudanese. She was instrumental in doing the Vermont legislation. She was a graduate from the University of Vermont. So yes, I mean, and let me just say to the person who put it in there, all are welcome. We are constantly looking for folks to, if you go on Maria or Meg, maybe you can just put our website, which is, under development, but there's information there, information about the coalition, who are members of the coalition. We certainly want as much outreach as we can. And I think, even if hopefully we get a law this legislative session, I think we've done a great job in the past 2 years of actually starting to engage in the public education. We've done these type of Facebook forums before. We did one, I think, a year or two ago to get the word out there. I think the participants who will see this later and who signed up, it's pretty varied. People have a varied group of folks have an interest, but we absolutely, yes, thanks, Maria. She put the website there, and then you can see who some of the coalition members are.
That's great. Thank you for that, Faith. I'd like to come back to where we started, and I know that Martine mentioned some of the dynamics, right? Some of the complexity of this work is that it does happen in silence. But if we could just touch back on who's doing this, where is it happening, where it's happening, and what are some of the statistics that you know of, and what are some of the statistics that you suspect based on the relative silence in which this happens?
I'll take the first, stab at that. I mean, I think one of the things that, I talk a fair amount about, and I hearken back, as I said earlier, to the child trafficking laws, is that you don't know the scope of the problem until you start to pull the curtain back. So we don't know. We have, best guess, there are some folks doing research on this. I think, all of, Zehra's talked about this, as well as Martine, and the first video. This is not something that people are, shouting from the rooftops that they were cut, or their culture is requiring them to cut their child. And, again, I think, Zehra did a great job of sort of separating the sort of culture from religion, this practice. But we don't have a sense of the scope of the problem. I think the best thinking is definitely minimally in the hundreds in Connecticut, girls who would be at risk of this happening. But there just hasn't been a lot of research. And I think that's because it's behind the curtain, Steve, and there's no light that's being shined on this, or the curtain is being pulled back. And until that happens, and I think we've talked about that. What happened in people's homes stayed in people's home. And until we said we're not going to tolerate that and pull back the curtain on issues like domestic violence, we would never have had any law changes. And it's not until we pull that curtain back then we really begin to see a change. So I think it's a tough question to answer because we don't know.
Yeah. Zehra, your reflections.
Yeah, and I wanted to reiterate something that Michelle had said earlier about, more than one is too high a number already. We know that this practice has no value. It has no medical value. It's only harmful. It's only risky. Why should anyone have to do it? I mean, to one person, that's their whole life. So what's that bar of how many people are affected by it before we say, no, this is not okay and we need to protect people from it? So, statistics I understand are useful for, enabling statutes like this, but on a personal level, one is too many. So it is very hard. And as Faith said, it's extremely hard to get numbers. And because there isn't a law here, we're not specifically, looking for FGM cases and noting them. They're usually kind of hidden within other things. I will tell you that for a lot of the doctors that we had spoken to around the world who have cut girls, usually bill them as just a vaginal exam. So they're not even noting down that they're actually doing something that may be considered illegal in their country or not. So the statistics are very, very hard to get. I want to also respond to one of the questions in the chat about silence again. I had said earlier that I've spoken to quite a few women, mothers who have told their daughters not to tell anyone that they haven't been cut, that if somebody asks, tell them you were cut. And yes, that absolutely does still encourage the practice, because there's a concept called pluralistic ignorance that I've learned from Sahiyo years and years ago that I have just found to be so relevant in this case, that people believe that other people are doing something. And, if they think, if people are telling them that, yes, they are doing it, even if they're not, they're going to go ahead and do that as well. And so, it really does encourage FGMC. And that's why our organization is called We Speak Out, because it really is so important for people to put their foot down and say, no, we're not going to do this. And we do have many people who do private activism. They speak with their families, they speak with their friends, community members, but they're not publicly supportive of the activism. And I will say that is just as important, because changing those social norms really comes from a very personal area. And having, I can do a webinar and talk to people and tell people, yes, this is a harmful practice, but it will be much more relevant to some people when it comes from their sister or their aunt or their cousin than hearing it from me, because I'm just, a face on Zoom. So that's really, that has to all work together, that public education, that public speaking out, and that private sharing of the risks, so that people understand that this social norm is not something that really makes sense in this modern society.
Well, Zehra from Sahiyo, and Faith from the Office of the Child Advocate, and Michelle from the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities, I really want to thank you for your thoughtful advocacy. So often in the world of advocacy, the policies and protections that we imagine come from up high. They're delivered by a thoughtful researcher or a policymaker. The most impactful and the most connected to community policies come from communities themselves, whether they are communities that have had lived experience, or where they are, or where there are communities where we are protecting a particular vulnerable part of our community that is saying, please protect us, please help us. In this case, gender-based violence against little girls. So I want to thank everyone on my panel again for your sharing, for your expertise, and for your advocacy. And I'd now like to hand the mic back over to Meg.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. Thank you, everybody, for your thoughtful responses. If we can quickly go to the Q&A for a moment, I think there are a few more questions from the audience that we'd love to get some clarification on. Excuse me. So one person asked, who is doing these interventions? Is it doctors, community people, family relatives? Is it currently illegal in Connecticut? So do we have any thoughts on that?
But when you say interventions, you mean preventing it from happening or educating? I think it's coming from lots of different places. It's really all about who picks up on it. So many of the conversations I've had in my community are just kind of passing by conversations that somebody has heard and then has told me about, and then we've kind of worked to help that person who made the comment help the person they heard it from. So it's very word of mouth. So I think it can happen in so many different ways, through communities, through physicians, through healthcare workers, whoever really spots it. And I think that's where so much of the education and training will help, because if health workers, for example, are trained to look for signs of FGMC, they're more likely to be able to find it and help, and put people in the right direction, as opposed to just ignoring it or not being sure what to do with it and letting it go. So,
Absolutely.
I think Martine talked a little bit about sort of who's doing it. I think that was a sort of part of the question as well, and it's it could be leaders within a community, or an auntie who's been doing it for years and years and years. Almost like going to the midwife of a tribe area. It's like, oh, this is the person who's been delivering babies and don't really have experience. And I think Martine talked about the perception of the doctor or the go-to person in a particular community. But again, I think we hear anecdotally some of this, but it's all still very much behind a curtain until it's talked about and a light shine on it. We're not gonna know the answer to some of these questions.
Absolutely, that's a great point. We have another question as well. Is there a roadmap for us to follow in Connecticut that has been used successfully in other states?
Yeah, in terms of legislation, it's a great question. We certainly have, very early on, we lined up all of the high points of legislation from around the country. And we looked at what was missing in some states. We talked to folks from other states. We certainly looked to Massachusetts, who had the most contemporary, a couple of years ago, legislation at that time. We liked that legislation. As I mentioned earlier, we worked with a woman who was instrumental in passing legislation in Vermont. And her regret about not really doing a public education piece because she really sees the downside. So I think what we looked at is took some of the, what we'd consider sort of model legislation from some states, and things that we believed in Connecticut would be important for Connecticut, and are crafting our own. So we're not reinventing the wheel, but I think we're taking what we believe would work here, and what other people have told us that they have, regrets about their legislation. So I think there has been a roadmap. We've deviated from any saying, okay, this is the gold standard. I'm not sure. I think maybe if there is a gold standard, it may be Massachusetts. But I think, taking the, who we are in Connecticut, what we value to be important here. I think we hope to craft a piece of legislation that's meaningful for us, for our state.
That's great. Thank you so much for that thoughtful response, Faith. If anybody else has any questions before we leave off, anyone in the audience? Okay, that's great. Thank you so much for a wonderful discussion and your thoughtful questions. If we could reshare the screen to the PowerPoint, that'd be amazing. We just want to leave you with some further resources. These resources include the Coalition's website. As we said in the chat already, please feel free to reach out to the Coalition through our website as well as our email. We also have further resources at sahiyo.com, and this includes a crisis line launched by the Asian Women's Shelter in partnership with Sahiyo. It's the first crisis line in the US that's equipped to handle calls concerning FGMC. So we're very excited about this. It's only for people in the United States though. So without further ado, I'll leave it off. Thank you everybody for attending. Thank you all again to the panelists. And I hope you have a good rest of your afternoons. I'll just be on a few minutes while everybody hops off. It looks like we're unable to share the resources, but please, as I said, feel free to go over to our coalition website where you can find all these resources there.